Well, welcome to all of you to the graveyard session this afternoon. Thanks for being here. We're going to be talking about new horizons of public culture. And just as we talk about horizons, the sun actually comes out and we really should all be outside. But here we are, listening to an incredibly proficient panel to basically engage with this particular topic. New horizons of public culture. Which type of institutional practices do we need? You all have the program, but I'm just going to read through the abstract so that we kind of get some kind of contextual understanding of what it is that we're going to be dealing with in this panel. Political and economic discourse usually takes utilitarian and instrumental approaches to culture as a public priority. Strong support for the arts is no longer present, and the public culture has to be legitimized, proven and confirmed more often by external rather than intrinsic values. In these unstable conditions, the cultural or public institutions struggle to adapt to the dynamics of changes in their socio-cultural, economic, and political contexts. The task for creating new institutional forms in culture that would work beyond inherited disciplinary lines, deliver public goods to citizens, and that would be based on decentralized and participatory models of governance gain increasing senses of urgency. So how we're going to be structuring this panel is that Justin O'Connor is going to be starting off with a 10-minute provocation, and then we'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves and respond either to the abstract that you just heard or to what it is that Justin has said, and each of them will have 3 or 4 minutes to do so. And then based on both Justin's input as well as what the panelists have said, we'll have a bit of questioning amongst the panel members themselves, and then we'll open up to the floor for you to engage with them. So, Justin, over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me beyond that one? It's not really a provocation. There's too many provoking things said on the age of Twitter, but it probably will annoy a lot of people, but it's really a plea, maybe even a prayer, you never know. So, let's see if I can do this. So as the abstract, as this session makes clear, there's a crisis of policy and culture, arts and culture. There's a crisis of language, I think, really, in how we describe it. And we all know about the economic and the instrumental language which we're forced to describe culture in, art and culture in. But I think that's known, and I want to move beyond that, because one of the problems I find is when we get a chance to say, well, and because the value of culture is, that also, I think, has collapsed. And I've found that time and time again among policymakers, policy analysts, city players, national players, we no longer know how to articulate the value of culture. We know how it shouldn't be, but we don't know how it should be positively. And of course, we've heard a lot about their participation, etc. But today I just want to say participation in what exactly? And I think we've heard, it's inevitable. We've kind of black boxed art and culture off. We know what that is, so shall we participate? How do we do it? How do we not do it? Etc., etc. But I want to go in and actually say, well, what actually is it that we want people to participate in? Because if we can't describe that, then we may as well all go home. Go and be a social worker or, an urban planner or, an entertainer, whatever. Unless you can articulate the value of art, culture in contemporary times, then we're kind of wasting our time. So, opening the black box. Art and culture, it amazes me how people slide between one and the other. And in particular, it's become quite common to say, oh, art's some kind of narrow thing. It's a kind of subset of this wider thing called culture. And possibly it was a conspiracy of the bourgeoisie at the end of the 18th century and various other bad people, but it's somehow time to take back art and put it into culture. And for various reasons, I think that is completely erroneous way of approaching things. Because art emerged at the end of the 18th century as a particular kind of knowledge. I would call it sensuous knowledge. And it did so when the world was only describable by science, economics, administration. And art emerged in a space of dislocation. Industrial revolution, imperialism, modernity, whatever. That's the space it emerged in. It was a symptom of a deep transformation and also an attempted cure. Somehow art would cure a dislocated humanity. Now, these things I think we need to seriously go back and have a look at. Of course they've changed in 300 years, but we need to be aware of that. Now, of course, we know how that became wrapped up in the state, in class, in nation, in citizens, and all of them, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, actually, it's context. We also know how it immediately put everybody else who wasn't European into the backwards category. You know, you do culture, we do art. So there's all kinds of problems with it, but I think we need to really keep on to it. So we often hear about Pierre Bourdieu saying how, elitist art is and exclusionary, but he also said, and he spent the last 15 years of his life saying, artistic autonomy is an historical gain and we have to vigorously defend it. And I want to know, well, why should we? If it's this elitist game wrapped up in, as we all know, all those, I won't go into all that, why should we defend it? And I think, first of all, I would say it's an important category that we have to understand. First of all, we have to talk about art and not the arts. And by that I mean the idea of art goes beyond what we historically call the arts. The fine arts, the Beaux-Arts, but also the institutions that we've inherited for the last 200 years. It's now very pervasive. It's gone into life in all sorts of different ways. It's gone into popular culture. It's not been displaced by popular culture. It's infused popular culture. And so I think there's a very false polarization of this democratization of culture versus cultural democracy. I just do not see that as a sustainable distinction anymore. Because if you do want to democratize culture, it leads to forms of cultural democracy. It changes what you're trying to democratize. So I think we have to open that up, because I think it's really debilitating, I think, now. Look at this. This is your classic Bourdieu thing. This is what he's talking about. And it's a kind of art that we're still talking about. Up on the left, there's all this high art. It doesn't make a lot of money, but it's very, very prestigious. And on the left, there's all that kind of mainstream stuff that's, makes money, but it's middlebrow. Down there is the avant-garde, and over there is popular culture, which for Bourdieu was low status, and it made no money. Well, of course, that's changed. And that's changed. I've just done this, and I've just made it up. The dominant culture that we're talking about, when we say get out of the art and get into culture, we're talking about popular culture, we're talking about new media, social media. That's where we're talking. Contemporary art's up there as a kind of an adjunct of international finance. It's up there, still got its status. Other places have gone. But what we're talking about, community arts, local arts, participatory arts, it makes no money and it has no status. It's been completely marginalised. And I think all of us are in a very marginal position. I think we have to understand that, really. So, we're in a position where we have to talk about cultural production. It's no good saying, oh, that's art, that's commerce out there, we're about participatory art. We have to talk about cultural production. We're no longer talking about individual producers. We're talking about large-scale, massive investment, production, a whole range of new people, managers, financiers, producers, infrastructural suppliers, all these kind of people. That is what we're dealing with. Unless we actually challenge that or get involved in that, then we're kind of, going nowhere. So I would say that art is no longer central to state legitimation. In fact, I think it's quite embarrassing to many states these days. There's all sorts of, as we know, instrumental justifications, but the symbolic value of art has declined. Get rid of that instrumental stuff, and there's nothing else there. So, the link between culture and citizenship that was so strong in cultural policy, that has gone. Culture is now configured in terms of consumption, and government is a facilitator of consumption. It's not about using the culture to build citizens. The value of autonomous art that I was talking about has now been distributed across the whole system. It's now basically an input into creative industries. And the centrality of commercial media production now, it is not dominated by intellectuals, artists, whatever. You know, as Nick Graan once said, the dominated fraction of the dominant class, the people who run culture, they're no longer given any say in actually how the media system works. That has gone somewhere else. So when we start talking about elitism in the arts, it's a little quaint corner of the elite we're talking about. The big elite is over here, and we never talk about it, and I think we need to. The worth of art itself. You know, class distinctions have not disappeared, as we all know, but art is not the main way in which those distinctions are made. Art's a stake in that game, but it's increasingly linked to niche consumption. It's a particular kind of consumption. It's not opposed to commerce anymore. It's just opposed to mainstream, boring commerce. The habitus of the cultural consumer no longer involve aestheticism or renunciation, as with Bourdieu. You know, I've got high status, but I don't make much money. You know, the great French school teacher. That's gone. It's about discerning choices among products. And we've got this idea of the artist. High in cultural capital, low in economic capital, the classic one. Is that so admired any longer? Commercial success is no longer automatically positioned as a sellout. And in fact, it can be a sign of election. Think of contemporary art. If you're not making money in contemporary art, you are a failure. So there's all these different ways. So the final one there, the growth of this cultural economy has colonized the life world. It's now part of our everyday life. So we can't oppose going to the ballet and going into the art gallery versus walking the dog as some kind of popular culture. In the middle of that, when there is this massive commercial system of video games, television, film, social media, all those kind of things, and it never gets talked about. It's as if there's art, elitist culture up here, art, and then there's the popular here. This middle bit, which is the absolute dominant cultural form of our time, is something which cultural policy people have to start thinking about. And when you start adding the digital in there, which has happened in the last 5 years, when you put the digital, the way in which the digital has reconfigured culture and made it part of basically the telecommunications industry in many ways, we're in a really deep and difficult situation. And if you want to look at how the digitally remastered state works, go to China. Have a look at China and its control of all the data that consumers are using in all sorts of ways. So we're no longer in a cultural state, a culture state, an art state. We're beyond all that. So I'm going to end, because I've got 3 more slides, and I'm going to end on something a bit practical. And I've thought, how would you describe a progressive approach to the economy of culture, or culture that is an economy? How would you describe that approach? And I would say, let's think about these. And it's a bit 2005 UNESCO convention, actually, but no longer thinking of the impact, but of what are the rights of cultural producers within it. You know, what are the economic opportunities? Everyone who wishes it should be able to participate and earn, or at least have a go at earning a living, that they have a chance to obtain recognition, respect, and partake in forms of self and shared communication and expression. And it's a political opportunity. Cultural work is part of a pluralistic society. I'll let you read that. These are basic things. We need to reassert them. You know, advancing social arrangements that allow for the maximum range of people to enter and participate in cultural work in which they will be fairly treated and justly paid and rewarded for their efforts. Follow that through, and that is a very, very, very radical policy. Ensuring that people are not prevented from entering cultural work on grounds of any unfair cultural discrimination or prejudice, etc. I won't go into that. Developing the cultural industries as a democratic arena where minority and marginal groups can advance their own fair representation. So these are some basic principles that underlie an approach not to art as some kind of out there, but as the mainstream form of cultural production. And I think we really have to be able to do that. So, last 2 slides. Finally, I would make a plea for what I would call objective respect. we can't just black box art as some kind, this is what people like and it's good for them. There are real, there are logics and practices, there are meanings embedded in the artwork, and I mean that in the widest sense of the artwork, we call it popular culture, whatever you want. But there are logics in that, and people make judgments about those logics, and they deliberate them. There is expertise around that. People decide about them. There are canons, many canons, and there are conversations around that. That's what the participation's about, talking about those things, not how we do budgets. That's really crucial as well. But it's also judging, aesthetic judgment, if you like, but how do we like it? How do we want that? So those kind of things that have to be built into a process. And I used this quote 2 days ago, but this is Brian Eno talking about this conversation. What we're talking about really is let's have a conversation about this, about what we call culture. Not about what we call culture, but culture as conversation, as a series of meaningful exchanges in different ways. And this conversation keeps us together, keeps us coherent. And I think this is going back to what this conference is about. What keeps us together? What keeps us coherent? And how do we really rethink why we think culture can help us do that? Thank you.
Okay, do the folk on the side want to just come and grab a seat? There we go. So our panelists have been fighting to go last, so I'm not sure who's going to go first. We'll just go kind of eeny-meeny. Mirko, would you like to maybe start off introduce yourself and then just respond either to the abstract or to what Justin?
Thank you. So I'm Mirko Petrić. I teach in a sociology department at the University of Zadar in this country, and I'm also active on the UNESCO Zaklada Kultura Nova project on participatory cultural governance. I would like maybe to respond to, not to respond, but to follow in Justin's footsteps, so to speak. He invoked autonomy. Autonomy invokes Kant for us, and autonomy of the arts and things like this. I would like to maybe start from Hannah Arendt in this particular context, because she is, of course, well known, notoriously well for the sentence describing the banality of evil. And I would think that it would not be bad to think about the evil of banality these days, the other way around. Then I would go to Lela Jankovic's sentence in the keynote lecture. She said, we've been rethinking participation all the time. Now maybe it's the time to rethink culture. Okay, I think it's time to rethink culture. And I would like to say that culture is not ordinary. So as opposed to, in contrast with what Williams said back in the late 50s, culture is not only ordinary, maybe, to be more modest. Culture should be aspirational in some way, at least in this framework of new public culture as conversation, and whatnot. Participation is not all good, as Frank Fischer said yesterday. I mean, I'm throwing these sentences at you because I think they are worthwhile thinking. Participation also, as much as culture, needs to be qualified. What do you participate in? What do you want to achieve? And somebody from Sicily said here, when asked about their cultural center, what do you want to achieve? They said, we want to achieve better persons at the end of the process. Now, that's aspirational in a way. To culture and social environment, in the process, achieve better persons. Why was Williams's culture is ordinary revolution in a way? Because it was emancipatory at that particular point in time. By saying culture is ordinary, he was speaking for the working class, for the culture for the excluded, for a new perception of people. So this is basically, I think, what culture should be doing. Second thing is that aspirational culture, I think, should be the part of new public culture. Secondly, I think there is a place for the state or for the public in this, not for Chinese state, for the state in this, because state is not only oppressor, state is also a guarantee of rights. And if we completely deconstruct the state as it is being done now, we will lose something important for the public culture. And therefore, I think we were speaking in the previous roundtable about this idea of civil-public partnership and not private-public partnership, which puts new actors into motion and leaves us with a cultural policy which is not only philanthropy, but something else, a dialogue between sides which sort of exclude the private. Private in itself must not be bad, although for me it's bad. It must not be bad, but it will certainly not contribute to public culture in the way that public-civil cooperation could. So this could be my initial thoughts on the subject.
Okay, thank you.
Do you mind if I go back over there? It's funny position. First of all, I just wanted to respond to some comments of Justin's, and then there's something I'd like to read out. Pardon? Sorry. My name is Bernadette Lynch. I've worked for, it feels like 100 years, but 35 years in the cultural sector in North America and in the UK primarily, but also all over Europe. I'm an honorary research associate at UCL in London, but I work on my main area of interest is critically examining what we would have called participation, but we're now calling it less that. So I would like to just say something about this, if you take away instrumentalism, what else is there? Comment of Justin's. And I think there is something else there. We're looking at a split, an absolute split in the cultural sector. And it's a split between a market-driven and a rights-based practice. And I think that's been noted before, but it's become quite overtly political. And I think that's quite interesting. It's creating a very interesting and political debate within the sector as a whole. And I think the issue about rights, and rights come up again and again here, it's not just the rights of cultural producers. It's unless you are looking at co-producers. It's the rights of those who are using culture or benefiting so what rights across the board is what we're looking at. And I'd like to, just because I'm in Croatia, pay tribute to somebody who absolutely influenced me in my career over 30 years ago, Tomislav, Croatian museologist, who coined the phrase of the useful museum. And he said, he used a very old-fashioned idea of why culture is important. He says, it's survival wisdom. It's how do we survive? What do we use to create the conversations that Justin talks about that helps us survive in the world? So I want to talk about optimism and pessimism because I think this conference has been full of both. And I think I wanted to just start off by talking about, to start with pessimism and end with optimism, about what I see happening in my travels through the cultural sector. The first bit I want to quote, and I've used it before, but it struck me as such an important thing. And this elderly Chinese woman standing in a room in a large and very well-known cultural facility, cultural center, arts center in the UK. And the room was full of professionals from the institution who were doing their participation, hitting their quotas, including people in the room. So there were a whole range of different small groups and organizations. And then at one moment, the woman stopped everything and she said, just a minute, what is it that you want to do to me? She said, what is it about me that needs changing? Which was a fantastically interesting question, mainly because nobody from the institution could answer it. What was it that needed improving? So what it did was kind of out the assumptions that were in that room around public participation. And it's the ethics of those relationships that I find are the most important and the most interesting thing. And I also believe the only way the cultural sector changes, it's incapable of changing itself while we're talking to ourselves. The only way it changes is by putting ourselves in at that kind of room, metaphorically and otherwise, where we are challenged about those kinds of ethical assumptions, about what the use of culture and how it's instrumentally used towards others. One of the things that I find the most interesting to do is to start off by breaking down the language that we write our policies with, or our funding applications, and sit down with the people who are going to be on the receiving end of them and break it down. You'll quickly find they are absolutely loaded with all of the values that we're talking about, and with all of the assumptions about social improvement, with a hierarchy of relations. And in my experience, rather than people being quiet and somewhat cowed by working with institutions, some of them very powerful institutions. I mean, I've worked with the Tate, the British Museum, the V&A. Rather than being cowed, given the opportunity, they have a heck of a lot to say. And that's when it gets interesting. So for me, what was a kind of process of evaluating how was it for you after the fact, with people working with the institutions after some participatory process, was actually where the action was. It's those conversations that's where real participation starts, where you're sitting in a room and you're having extremely uncomfortable conversations about assumptions. I'm a big believer in asking the question about theory of change. What's your theory of change? Because my goodness, we all carry them. And we carry them in all kinds of prejudicial ways in terms of our assumptions about what we can do for or on behalf of people within this sector. Much of it very colonialist. Anyway, I must end. But that's basically what I wanted to say. But one last thing, the reason to be optimistic is that it's changing. Rights-based practice is growing like crazy. If I had time, I could give you many examples that are very optimistically turning this on its head and going into not the comfort zone, the discomfort zone of breaking this down with people. Okay, thank you.
Maybe just pass it.
Yeah.
Okay. So I should apologize. I asked the question in the first keynote and I didn't introduce myself. So apologies for that. My name is Tomislav Medak. I wear several hats. I'm part of the collective that runs Multimedia Institute in Zagreb, that part that does mostly theory program. Though I'm no scholar in this arena, I'm more like a practitioner. My second hat is that I work with the theater collective BADco, whose installation you can see outside. But here I'm going to speak with a hat that relates to one of the organizers of this event, UNESCO. So UNESCO describes the project that I and a colleague do, and it's called Memory of the World. Is an international initiative launched to safeguard the documentary heritage of humanity against collective amnesia, neglect, the ravages of time and climatic conditions, and willful and deliberate destruction. It calls for the preservation of valuable archival holdings, library collections, and private individual compendia all over the world for the posterity, the reconstruction of dispersed or displaced documentary heritage, and the increased accessibility to and dissemination of these items. So this is the promise that UNESCO makes. However, it doesn't deliver. Now, in the age of digitality, access has become something that is almost ubiquitous, and that has had the effect that UNESCO cannot deliver this promise. So there are people stepping in to deliver this promise. So I work in an area that is typically called shadow libraries or pirate digital libraries, making available books, mostly scholarly writing that is behind paywalls to the general public. And I would approach this issue of market culture within the market territory, culture within rights territory, maybe from a perspective of even uneven development, because knowledge does get produced in an unevenly structured, economically unevenly structured world. So let me just take out my notes. I have several things to say, so not that I don't say something that I... So I think there are several challenges that institutions nowadays face. First, institutions are under attack, I would say, in a world that is dominated by platform capitalism that sees most of the public functions reverting to the markets. It's a perfect storm where we see the retrenchment of the welfare state and cuts in the arts, for instance, where we see techno-solutionist attempts to replace participation, procedurality, and trust that we usually laid into social institutions onto technologies, like think blockchain. It's also, to this perfect storm, contributes also crisis of political participation in a world of market-conforming democracy, as Angela Merkel has called it. So we have economic pressures that are beyond the democratic decision-making. Hence, political participation, voter turnout is just declining for obvious reasons, rational reasons, I would say. What we expect from institutions, and in particularly institutions of learning, so public libraries, that's the field that I'm looking at, and where the action of people doing illegal digital libraries is contributing to, is that institutions should provide first an inclusive arena. They should be able to accommodate heterogeneity, antagonism, and complexity, something that frequently gets looked over in techno-communitarian discourse, where a community of values can set its own agenda for the rest of the society, whereas institutions do not function like that. They provide social integration and they sustain resources over time. Now, in the arena of public learning, so public libraries have emerged in a period of revolutions, of the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, as a demand, popular demand that knowledge and education be widely available, and that they not be instrumental solely for the needs of the economic system, but rather that the working class can define its own terms of public engagement, and that is what defines basically participation in a democracy. With the transition to digitality, for instance, public libraries have been denied in providing access that digital technologies have in a way enabled. They've been limited in that primarily by publishers who, for obvious reasons, have feared to enter into digital and then give lending rights to public libraries. So with this crisis of access, again, communities have stepped in. I have studied in the 90s at the University of, at the School of Arts and Humanities in Zagreb, and in our seminar library in the philosophy department, very little was available. To my colleagues, 20 years younger, everything is available. It's available for reasons that there is an illegal access, because the library at the school that I was studying in Zagreb does not have a legal way to access those. And we need to talk about these things, no? Yeah, I need to be shorter. Okay. I would, if I had a chance, I would have shown two maps. One is where top universities in the world are headquartered. They're headquartered mostly in 4 or 5 areas that are economically most developed. I would have shown you also the map of Croatia and show you the level of higher education attainment, where you would see that there is a huge difference between cities, primarily Zagreb, and the rest of the country, where educational attainment is very low, and it stays so across generations, so from parents to kids. So we should, I think, be thinking of institutions, how we can transform them while keeping the vision that they are a place where society is inclusive, it can handle complex issues, antagonizing issues, think climate change, no? And where we can unsettle the inequalities that exist in the world around us. Okay. So.
Do you have those maps available?
Yeah, I do on my computer, but let's not make that complicated. Yeah.
Let's move on.
Yeah, okay. So hi everybody, my name is Márton Gosztonyi. I'm from Budapest, and while I was sitting here, I was really thinking about why am I actually sitting here, because I'm a practitioner, and after this very great speeches, I was thinking that what can I add to this conversation? And what I would like to add to this is the concept of power. So, but to add this kind of concept to the discussion, I would like to tell you a story. So I'm here to represent Auróra. Auróra is a social enterprise and a community place and a cultural place in Budapest. And basically, we run the place in a very basic participatory way. The fact what's actually happened with Auróra during the summer, that the Hungarian government shut us down. To actually get a little bit broader concept why they did this, Auróra is a very value-based informal organization. So we really not let me frame it in a very polite way, not a huge fan of those ways in a political or a social terms what the Hungarian government right now are actually presenting. And a lot of activist groups are coming together in the house, a lot of different NGOs coming there, a lot of people having different debates about different things in Auróra. So it's an open platform for everybody. But as we were growing and as more and more people join us, we actually entered the power arena the political power arena. And first the media get attention against us, and after that 20 policemen in gear came to the house and started arresting people. After that, we went to the court, and the miracle happened that we won. So legally we were right, and now we are actually fully functioning. But what I really would like to add to this conversation, so that's why I was thinking that what on earth can I add to this conversation? So when you are working in a very deliberate and very group-based decision way, you always construct different power structure, and it's always a question that what's going to be the answer of the other institutions to this one. And I think that Auróra example can be I don't know. I hope it can be a very excluded example. What the national or other institution can give to this innovation as an answer, but it's always a question that what's going to happen when these really grassroots organization gain some kind of a power, you know. I don't have an answer for that. So during the 3 years while we have been doing Auróra, we have more questions than answers. So we have a lot of questions about what's really a good way to do this kind of participatory stuff, and what's so. For example, there is a huge problem with time. So there is a very huge inequality in this participatory game. That, for example, those people who have a lot of time, they have much more sense to participate in these very long discussions. And when we started the whole thing, we had more than 4 or 5 hour long discussions. Who on earth has time for that? Okay, so obviously those people who have the capital, social capital or economical capital or work as a freelancer or something like that, they have free time to do that. But what about those people who are working class people? And so there are some very basic questions. We don't have the answer for that. So we just struggling with these questions. But I have tons of these questions like that. But I think I should move or pass the microphone to others to add some new perspective or question to the dialogue.
Use the orange one.
Okay, hello. My name is Biljana Tanurovska Kjulavkovski. I already took 3 minutes in introducing of my time, and I come from Macedonia, from Skopje. It's the capital of Macedonia, and actually I'm a cultural producer, manager, and a curator in contemporary performing arts. I work since 90s, let's say, in this context, and I work in the context of freelance or independent cultural scene, as we name it, also in different regional initiatives. So to this talk, actually, I would like to contribute to through the practice that I have in my surrounding or in the context, and actually to think about the institutional practices, or the question, what kind of new institutional practices do we need nowadays, through observing the models or modes of governing, but also managing the cultural institutions or the public space, let's say. So I would start with Simon Sheikh saying what is a cultural institution, or what is a cultural public institution. Says it's an imaginary ensemble of practices, beliefs, and truths that we all subscribe to and thus constantly reproduce. So the question here, what arises, is actually does institution that we produce nowadays, or institutional practices, adhere or adapt to the logic and demands that we have and surrounding us, or do we seek another path? Or what is this path actually? Does the institution self-institute or attribute to the outside power and regulations? What we heard nowadays, we were talking about constant crisis, political, economic, social crisis that affect the way how we actually govern, produce, and they affect the crisis of the public sphere and public space. It's a political deed of a public sphere, let's say. We have to think about reformation of these public spaces in order to reform already, let's say, or constantly corrupted public sphere in our, let's say, context, what we have. So the methods, and thinking about methods, one of the methods we are talking about is this participative governance method. But through the practices, I was thinking, what about to talk, for example, a rhizomatic method of governing or of model of institution? And I took as an example the Lucian-Guattari rhizome explication, trying to convert it into the logic of institution, then to deconstruct it into a practicalities, for example. So there is one thing that, and it would stipulate the following, for example, what is a rhizomatic governance? Can act in its multiplicity by resisting the vertical organizational structure, and can be characterized by constantly establishing connections between organizations of power, circumstances, etc., etc. So in that logic, what would be, for example, rhizome institution or rhizomatic? It's rather than narrativized history and culture will present culture and art in its map of influences without genesis, without being at the end, in its potentiality, always in the middle, etc. That means always reimagining itself. So how we practically can do this? In other words, we always have to reaffirm our institutional practices, to search for new, or never to stick to one method, or always try to different methods in its heterogeneity or diversity, let's say. So what we do as a practical thing, I have two practical examples. One is Nomad Dance Academy, and it's a platform, regional platform, that practically try to adhere this logic of rhizomatic, let's say, institution by its principles, which are three principles upon we work. And another one is one project space, it's Kinokultura. We started 1.5 years ago, and it's an organization that started as a space of two organizations that started renting one space, and were additional partners joining and forming the programs for the community and civil society. So it is a set of private, public, and civil bodies that in their diverse legal forms are coming together and aiming to reconfigure or refigure the meaning of the public space in culture and attribute to the reformation of already endangered, as I said, compromised public sphere, which means not to split, but to relate with these diverse private, public, and civil bodies. And another thing is that what we tried is to have this space as a space for contemporary art, and firstly to defend the content of contemporary art in its logics and its specificities and how it's produced. And another thing, what was said, is why we did it. One certain goal and wish is to achieve is better working conditions for us as a cultural workers, cultural creators, or artists there. So yes, actually here I'm advocating these heterogenic approaches that would enable us actually to address these specificities, what we have in our local context, but also to try out and experiment this imagining what I said about. And I would end with this mail and conversation we had with a colleague and collaborator, Ivana Ivković. She said, if we want to defend our sphere, not the sphere, but actually the spaces in which we produce, we really have to rethink these methodologies of working, collaborating, and thinking together. So that would be it.
Thank
you. My name is Teodor Celakoski. I'm coming from Zagreb, Croatia. I'm an activist and culture worker. I might say that generally I'm working in a kind of two field or two, let's say, sphere of activities that are highly interconnected. One is dealing with protection of public infrastructure, public goods. We have a huge platform of that campaigns against privatization of public infrastructure. We collaborate with the unions, with numerous civil society actors, with individuals from public sphere, and opening these processes for the participation of many citizens. So, for instance, in a country of 4 million, less than 4 million people who have a voting right, we gathered in 15 days more than 500,000 signatures against privatization of a public highway system. And we, in the process, we stopped this thing that it should go to the Goldman Sachs to run it for the next 40 years. This is one example. Another is fighting for protection of public squares that were destroyed by some private investments around. There we were not successful in this case in Zagreb, or fighting against building a huge real estate project in Dubrovnik with golf courses and stuff like that. So this part of, let's say, contestation logic And the other part is the institutional innovation logic, where both on the civil society or toward the public authorities, I'm trying to instigate the processes of changing bits of a culture policy environment in Croatia. And some of the results are connected to networking, to new institutions and foundations and stuff like that. So I see these two aspects as a kind of crucial components of what should be kind of handling or fighting for public goods and common goods. And in a way, my intervention around the issue of institutions and how we should think about them is that we have to see how to open them and, in a way, how to commonize them in a way of allowing, because there is a huge debate and a little bit of fashion about the commons nowadays on the, let's say, left or new scene all over the Europe and worldwide, that commons or governing as through the logic of commoning is something what is a new paradigm to solve the problem of corrupt state, the privatized public institutions on the one side within the public sector, and on the other side that failure of a market or a big story about that this will provide everything to everyone on the long run, been delegitimized by the crisis in 2008. So this answer by this scene, let's say we are also participating in this, of like commonizing is the answer to this binary system of state and market. I would say that this starting to be a kind of a new, let's say, a little bit of fetishist approach to imagining some kind of a new modern way of anarchistic approach to things. Let's build, our environments against these two huge forces. But somehow I think the logic and understanding of what is commons and what is that basically how you define the status of a good is a result of a fight. And in one sense, we can say that these days, like a historical gain of having an art and culture system as a historical gain that we have to start from. Yes, I agree, but somehow we have to reconceptualize how we open it and how it is a tool for at least communicating all what is happening in never so much changing environment, and not, the cards are not anymore like the game is not finished in a way. In 90s it looks like, okay, everything is fine, and you go to European conferences and they are so boring, but everything is predicted, We will all be better in future, and the market will provide this for this, and state will help market to do this in a way. So now it's not anymore that clear what agenda, and it is it is clear that it is issue of struggle. What will prevail in which phase? We are losing at the moment, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive to influence the processes. In that sense, building a new type of civil public, open institutions that creates local environments for building and renewing institutions and building coalitions for fighting for public goods and stuff like that, that this should be kind of a target or a goal for rethinking of what should some social and public institutions do. And what is important, we should, although we secure or we think that we secure the art and culture field as autonomy and somehow in itself self-regulated. We have to think about what is happening with other public goods, like water, privatization in Italy and all over. And now remunicipalization it in Berlin or different places. So there are important processes with other resources, and we have to see what is happening with this. And one of the answers is let's say recommunizing the public. So it is still the public, but it has more participative channels or systems, or that should be locally built. So there is no recipe for this in a way. So that means that, the part of the struggle and the part of the institutional innovation should be also connected in the approach of building new institutions.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those introductory remarks. Here we are 1 hour later into our panel, and I think some very kind of important themes have been raised. I just wanted to maybe come back to some of the themes that have to do with the arguments that we make on behalf of the arts and culture sector. I was just wondering whether we as a sector have kind of been disempowered to the extent that we do not really engage in making arguments that are convincing enough for decision makers. It comes back to what you were asking earlier about us being in the room with the people where the uncomfortable questions that have been asked. It comes back to what you were talking about in terms of understanding what is happening in other sectors, and when it happens to us, we feel so offended, but actually if we look at other very basic services where it's happening to as well, are we actually in alliance with those who are suffering, those kinds of things as well? We tend to operate in silos. And maybe just as an introductory thing on my part, a couple of weeks ago I was at the meeting of ministers of culture and senior officials responsible for arts and culture from the African, Caribbean and Pacific. And they were meeting, they meet every 4 years. And what was very interesting about this meeting is that through the course of the discussions, one of the overriding themes that seemed to emerge was that they need to promote culture in a much more transversal kind of way, understanding culture in terms of value systems and traditions and belief systems and so on, and how this impacts on all sectors of society, on transport, on health, on education and the like. And they were saying that in terms of course, you would know as well that many arts and culture ministers occupy the bottom of the political food chain, so they have very little influence. And yet, what they seem to be saying is that if they had their way, they would ensure that there is a person responsible for culture in each of the other departments to understand, help those departments to understand the relationship between culture and those particular departments, and then to come up with mitigating strategies as to how to work when there's an adverse effect of culture on that particular thing or vice versa. But essentially, when they speak about arts and culture or cultural policies, we are speaking about policies that have to do with the arts as opposed to culture. So I suppose my question to us as a panel is, do we, in terms of making the arguments for arts and culture, limit ourselves and disempower ourselves by ourselves kind of limiting what it is that we speak about to the arts, as opposed to having much more sophisticated and politically convincing arguments about culture more broadly, with the arts being but an expression of that?
Okay.
Nodding your head.
Yes, I was agreeing. But I don't think as a defensive position or, as a way to justify the arts by arguing that the arts has a role in every part of life. The arts does have a role in every part of life, and we are mutually dependent on those conversations. So, something I meant to say is that I think we should start using the phrase radical collaboration. It's not mine. It's Nina Simon's phrase, rather than participation. And we need to look at radical partnerships in the sense of Are we talking to road builders? Are we talking to other people mapping out your the area in which you live? I mean, I know I can give an example of one institution, the Middlesbrough Art Gallery, that's in England, that is deeply involved in the art utile movement, a useful art movement, which is very interesting and worth looking at. But the way it works, the gallery, is to say, not to say come to us, it's out there working with civil housing projects, with looking at how do we all get together in the room and look at what change needs to happen in this failing city. This is a city with massively high unemployment, high migrant population. How do we make this city work? So our contribution is part of that conversation. So now, rather than it having been a glass box that landed in a failing city, now it has a use. This and the discussions are taking place visibly within the gallery space with all of these different partner organizations from around the town. This is not a defensive position. This is a logical position of placing art at the service of society, working alongside in partnership with other organizations. To me, it's the only way to go, because otherwise relevance is a real issue for us. We're living in a troubled world. We have to be relevant, and that's the only way we're going to do it. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Anybody else?
You want to comment on that? Anyone else? No? Okay, I suppose then maybe just to follow up on your answer, you were talking earlier about the binary opposition of a rights-based approach on the one hand to an economic market-driven approach. The kind of theme that we picked up yesterday in the one panel discussion. Is it that, again, we set these things up as binaries when actually what we should be looking at in cultural policy is a gamut, a continuum, that there is room for instrumentalization, there is room for a rights-based approach, there is room for a market-driven approach, as opposed to it's either this or that. And I'm speaking about this in the context of our South African kind of policy-making context, where it is right that, given the conditions that most people live in, that sometimes theatre is used, for example. Okay, let me just give a practical example. Recently, I was commissioned as a playwright to do a play on the theme of food security. So that's, in a sense, been instrumentalized using theatre as a way of raising consciousness about hunger, about issues related to food security in our country. But I had a complete blank canvas to do it on. I wasn't instructed to say, these are the didactic points that need to come across. This is something that you need to do and research as an artist. This is what we need. We wanted to catalyze discussion, but ultimately it is towards this good end kind of thing. It's not as if instrumentalization is a bad word in and of itself, but I think that sometimes we fetishize it a bit and we make it into that, as opposed to what you seem to be ending off your answer earlier with, which is about if we're making art play a role at the service of society, then inevitably there will be some element of instrumentalization. I don't want to make this a conversation between the two of us, but
I'd like to answer.
Please do.
Sorry, and then I'm going to give it... I absolutely agree the role of the state is extremely important, but more in line with my colleague over here who talked about protecting the rights of citizens to engage in a democratic way and use the arts as part of that. So, for example, talking about food security, absolutely, the arts having a role and there being a request for that to be addressed through any number of the publicly funded services is perfectly reasonable in my view. And also on the point of market-driven or market-based, I mean, my issue is I've seen major cultural institutions in the UK, for example, now the emphasis is all market. It's blockbuster exhibitions, it's enter through the shop and exit through the cafe. That's the model. Now it's all about sale. So now talk about losing a purpose in terms of art and society. But that doesn't mean that money is a dirty word. It doesn't mean that it isn't important to look at how does this work in terms of sustainability, sustainable communities, social enterprise, and so on. All of these things are not contradictory. It's just smart.
Does anybody want to respond to anything that they might have heard from other panelists before we open it up to the floor? Yeah, sure.
I think instrumental. The idea of an instrumental, it means you're using something against its own nature. I mean, that's what it means. You're using it. You don't see it as an end in itself. You're seeing it as something. You're using it against its nature, and it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, that's why instrumentalism is bad. Seen as that, it's a misuse of whatever you're using. But that's not the same as saying art should not be useful. And nobody, as far as I have ever heard, has ever said art should not be useful. But it's got to be useful in its own terms. And the idea, autonomy itself, when Schiller and all those people talked about autonomy, they also the reason why it needed to be autonomous is because in that way it would help society, humanity, mankind, whatever. So if art's useless, then it's useless. Let's not even bother talking about it. Well, instrumentalism is when you're using it in a way that goes against the nature of what you're using. So, I mean, there's lots of traditions of people using. I mean, the social novel, Les Miserables, Dickens, Russian constructivism, lot different ways in which art is about speaking and changing society, and that's its instrument. So there's nothing wrong with that, and I think it was a linguistic thing that happened sometime in the 90s between instrumentalism versus intrinsic value. I think that was the worst linguistic invention. It was terrible because then suddenly, if you didn't want to be instrumental, you were talking about art for art's sake, and I would shoot anybody who uses that phrase, art for art's sake. But it's this idea of art has a function, and its function is to be found in its nature, and you use it as best you can. Once you start to misuse that nature, that's when it becomes instrumental. But of course, it's a social function, and that's what it should be. And we've moved a long way around that. And if art is not instrumental in that sense, useful, then it doesn't end up as art for art's sake. It ends up as entertainment, basically. So.
So you spoke of the gamut. Yes, I think there is, but there are some useful differentiations that we make. A concept that I really detest is cultural and creative industries packed all in one thing. Because I think cultural industries, they are primarily driven by economic structure, but their artistic value is intrinsic to what they are producing. Whereas creative industries, they contribute value to something that another industry is producing. So think construction, think media. So in that sense, like policy incentives for creative industries are not in the same place as cultural industries. Cultural industries are a thing of themselves, think film, think publishing, whereas, architecture, whereas game design, whereas all that you really need to invest into industries for this to be able to meaningfully contribute to the society from use value perspective, no? And then there is, obviously, art can be political. You can think in Benjaminian terms that you can do politicization of aesthetics, and it can be political in that way, but it need not be ultimately, no? And that's the gamut. It can cover from being totally socially unuseful and in a way shunning society. I think, if you've been to the exhibition today and seen Tomislav Gotovac's work, much of its merit is exactly in being that. So I think that's the gamut, and we need to make those differentiations when we think about where these things exist in our social world and world of regulation.
Can maybe just make a comment and then we can open it up to the floor to engage.
Okay, maybe I can skip it then, if you don't have time.
No.
Okay, I was actually going to try to think further about what you said, that we are not speaking to the ministries, to those in power, in the language they would like to hear or they can understand or whatnot. Of course, it's a question of agenda setting. It's a power of definition. And it is them who have the power at this very moment. And I'm deeply disturbed by the fact that actually they also succumb to the power of the EU when they talk to you. So basically, we are not even talking to our national, regional, local, and whatnot governments. We are talking to the EU agenda, which is actually, a conduit for marketization of the continent, so to speak. So 1 year long, Culture Action Europe was lobbying for the President of European Commission, Juncker, to utter the word culture in his State of the Union address. Did not happen. Beyond cultural heritage as a tool for tourist profit and job creation. You see, and then the problem is that it gets transferred to the national, regional, local level, and when you come with ideas of different kind, then they tell you, see, where is job creation, where is this? So my point is that through this public or civil partnership, talking to the levels below the EU, which sets the agenda right now, maybe it's easier to carve a little niche for different sorts of approaches, even if you have to be instrumental and invoke national governments. We are losing our small language, we only speak 4 million people, we cannot do this through job creation and through creative industries or whatnot. So maybe this is a place where something can be negotiated. This is a place where definitions can be changed from below, and maybe then our regional or state governments can maybe also sort of take part in a different discussion with different arguments. If they just reproduce the arguments that they hear elsewhere, we have a problem. And another problem is, yesterday somebody was speaking about participation, helping, and civil society and whatnot to deliver services. What about the services which cannot be delivered in less than 30 years' time? There are services done by certain instances which you can only feel after 30 or 40 years. When it's project environment, you don't evaluate, you don't participate, you don't know what it is, and then it's useless. It's a question of sustainability. This is why I would argue strongly for actors other than private markets, EU, supranational, and so on, to negotiate with the sector, us to try to negotiate with them, to change the agenda a little bit.
Just maybe on that, before we open it up to the floor, the issue about institutions and about influencing policy from the bottom up, as opposed to our politicians having the power, as it were. Do our institutions not have power as well, even those that are publicly funded?
True.
Could our institutions not, in a way, get sufficient social support, public support, and make such an impact that eventually they are changing policy? They don't have to simply be do what we say kind of.
I would agree, yes.
Yeah.
I would argue for that.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, now we can open it up to the floor. But thanks, Mirko. So are there questions or comments from the floor that you'd like to pose to any of the panelists? No. Okay, well, let's go home. No, just kidding. Let's give you more time. Any comments, questions? It has been a long day. There've been, and actually a long 2 days of people engaging with quite in-depth and intense theoretical pieces. We don't have to continue. Dea, do we have to? Yeah. Okay. And there's the troublemaker.
In fact, there were so many challenging issues that I would like to discuss, but I just want to say to you that instrumentalization of the arts, when we are fighting against that we are fighting against evaluation of the impact of the arts and having funds only if you can justify in advance. For example, when ECF made a competition for art for social change, they're not going to evaluate art project, they're going to evaluate the discourse of the artist that he is planning in advance how his artistic project is going to contribute to social change, which is totally absurd, which makes us professors teaching people to make false discourses about their artistic work, because that's the only way to get funding. And then evaluating artwork only by the fact if that contributed to whatever. So then again, if I am writing about how certain piece of art contributed to peace and reconciliation in the region, it might look really serious that this piece of art really contributed to the peace and reconciliation, and in reality might not really contribute it. But that's only one issue. The more important issue for me for this afternoon session is this question about public institutions and their equipment or even responsibility to act in public interest, helping civil society organization, independent sectors, individual artists, artistic collectives to do their projects and realize their idea. And that is something that is happening, at least in our region, but sporadically and depending on the autonomy of the public institution, and this autonomy is, conquered and lost every now and then by changing of the ministries and by changing of the directors of cultural institutions. So you can have in the same circle, let's say in Belgrade, public museums, you can have, how many? We have 15 museums, and you have only 3 directors who dare. So they dare to collaborate with independent sector. They dare to introduce some new challenges and new ideas. And nobody has that as obligation. And nobody see that, cultural institution as responsibility, because it's not only their responsibility to fulfill, to deliver minimal production for what they've been created, as they do theaters. They do how many? 6 premiere per year. That's it. If they have spaces during summer free, how many of them are giving that to any artistic collective to perform? Nobody. And they are using 95 public resources from culture. So they are well paid to do serious job. Most of them are doing decent jobs and have good art products, but they are not really socially responsible, and we devote a lot of energy, a lot of time to raise capacities of independent sector in society, which is in fact ignoring independent sector, not to mention what was in our previous debate today, which unfortunately not majority of you have heard, that Montenegrin law, for example, prohibits public budget to give money to NGOs. So this is the fact which is already 5 years existent. And 0 NGOs in Montenegro for culture get public funding because they said it's prohibited by law. And EU, and they are in the process of accession, and EU do not react. And then I will close my speech only with supporting the statements that unfortunately EU policies, not only using terminology, creative industries and so on, they are really focusing only on job employment, economic values, and that's something which is, which is transferred, that replaced the word market, which was in the beginning of 90s, cultural market and so on. Now it's about job, employments, as it is the main function of creative industries to create new job opportunities. And in fact, the reality is, I would say, totally different. For example, a whole gaming production community in Novi Sad is not contributing to Serbian budget. They are sitting in Novi Sad and working for world major companies. So it is kind of illegal work, and I mean, I don't know, it's illegal work, but it's part of this global economy, and this has nothing to do with creative sector in Serbia, nothing to do with cultural industries in Serbia. And yes, I would lobby very much that we use very precise terms, and when we say cultural industry, we know what we are speaking about. When we use the term creative industry, we really don't know what we are speaking about. And I don't want to see video clip of advertising agency, although employing film directors, designers, and so on, as something creative. Having some joke intended to make you shopping is really nothing to do with real creativity. So we are banalizing the word creativity too much. And at least when we are in cultural sphere realm discussing, that we discuss very seriously how much public institutions have to offer more than they are offering. So that really the speech that we heard yesterday about blurred frontiers in between public and civil sector and private sector really starts to happen. Up to now, I don't see in cultural sector, maybe political science achieved that in some other fields, I see still this, how would say, divisions as extremely strong. Thank you.
Okay, there are another two hands over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Levente Poljak. I would like to pick up on this and go look at the other side a little bit, because what I see in many cases that public funding creates dependence and really very strong control. When, for example, in certain countries, you as an NGO, you can have certain benefits or access to spaces, but you cannot produce any revenue. And this can very easily create a mechanism that every year this is reviewed by the power, the public authority, and depending on how friendly you were to the authority, then you can be renewed your contract or not. So I think on the other side, yes, let's not, I find it very important to speak about the boundaries, but I think in many cases the boundaries are very blurry, and very blurry which are benefiting the cultural community, because this is how they can create, by creating certain sources of revenue, this is how they can create a bit of economic independence as well. And I think, yes, I think these boundaries, I mean, we spoke about what is cultural industry, creative industry, and I see that in many communities, cultural production, cultural activities, arts are very closely connected to other social activities. In a lot of subcultures you have a lot of activities around sustainability, cycling, or it sounds very banal, but there's a lot of activities very closely connected to culture. And that's why I think very strongly dividing a cultural community, only cultural activities from a cultural community's activities that would maybe not fit to your definition or some of ours definition of culture, I think it also simplifies and banalizes a lot of things. So I would like to make it as a provocation, because I think we are trying to draw the boundaries, which are very important, because this is how policies and legislations can be made, but also we're, with drawing certain boundaries, we also simplify things which are not as simple.
Okay. I'm Vjeran Katunaric from the University of Zadar, where Mirko Petrić is from, so we work together. I started to deal with these issues about cultural industry within the framework of cultural policy planning and development. And as a philosopher by vocation as well, I was very much astonished by the very term. And I said to my colleague, what's this? Well, my first association was to Adorno, and Horkheimer cultural industry chapter, which is, the classical frame of reference for this basic, was this source of the meaning. Meanwhile, as we know, the term was going into plural, cultural industries, and has been recycled until, well, not that easy, but until several years ago when I have the opportunity to read the first critical text against the term itself, in a tone which is basically Adornian, aesthetic criticism of Enlightenment and his point about fascism and all uniformity of taste, etc. Let me add just a few more, two more notes. When I, with my colleagues, when we started to conceptualize the framework of cultural policy, and we started to think in general concepts, and together with our British colleague, we started to think about how major dilemmas as regards cultural policy can be formulated. One of the dilemmas was culture as an end and culture as a means, Of course, it's a very, very useful and, let's say, heuristic distinction, but sometimes the boundaries are blurred, really. And you never know, as Milena said, what will happen with cultural action and cultural products in 20 years from now. And for now, it is maybe banal, but it will not be anymore. In a near future, so to speak. So, there are many examples showing that, for example, if you use your cultural production in terms of be in cooperation with other sectors, this is something which might help a lot to cultural producers. But also it may make a certain production purely commercial. So it depends, it varies. It is contingent, in other words. Okay. And my last note concerns the linguistic side of this instrumental. It reminds me, maybe it is a kind of cultural war about the term. In English, which is, of course, not the only natural language, so to speak, but it is in a way penetrated by English philosophy, traditionally, utilitarian. Instrumental, to my mind, means be useful, as you said, for something else. Biti koristan, okay, be useful. In German language, which is also impregnated with German philosophy, especially idealistic from Kant to Habermas, instrumentelle Vernunft, instrumental reason is pejorative, is something negative. You see what I mean? So these two traditions have somehow have been crossed over but intersected in this particular area. I cannot speak on behalf of Slovenian cultural research or someone else, but we should be aware of this linguistic culture fact, but it is not only fact, it is a kind of policy. It is ultimately a culture war.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there other comments from the floor before I ask the panel to maybe respond? Arundhati. Yep.
Hello. Yeah, it's more an observation of listening to this whole question of what arguments do we make as a sector from countries mainly where there was always a lot of public funding for the sector. And over the last many years, this has been coming down. And a sort of desperation to figure, how do we then re-argue this? Where the people to whom we are making this argument is essentially people in political and bureaucratic positions in charge of budgets. Ultimately, it's a question of making these arguments so that there are enough sustainable resources. I find the question of arguments very different in the country where I come from, India, where there's hardly any public funding for the arts and culture. And therefore, there are multiple diverse ways and strategies in which each and every arts and culture group has to think about their sustainability and continuing to do their work. The arguments that they have to make about why they do what they do, really, they have to make continuously to multiple stakeholders in that process, and most importantly to themselves and to their own community of other artists and scholars and practitioners. So just an observation how when there's a panel of practitioners and scholars coming from countries where it's mostly public funding, even if it's less today, you still have some, there's a certain way in which we think of making these arguments, because these arguments are being made to a certain kind of person, not to ourselves. We are not making these arguments to us here saying, why do we really do what we do? Perhaps if we think that way, some of the answers may be open, different, I don't know, but it could give us probably other ways of thinking too. So just an observation. Thank you.
Okay, there's another hand over there. And then that's it.
Violeta Semjanovska, University of Arts in Helsinki. Coming from Macedonia, by the way, but at the moment I'm working in Helsinki. And I just wanted to raise this issue about values of arts and culture. We should not forget that this discussion increased in the last 10 years because of the needs of the public sector. This discussion it was not provoked by our sector, the practitioners and art sector, but the public sector. Don't forget about Holden that really tried to help to the public sector to define, to make a structure and to argue why public money should go in arts and culture. So it was easy to quantify economic values, number of employment, impact, sold tickets, etc. Maybe social numbers, people, young people helped by art. But the problem is with intrinsic. Maybe somebody didn't like this term, intrinsic value. But for example, Berlin Philharmonic made a concert recently for immigrants. How we can value this? Who can value and who can say what this concert provoke? What kind of emotions provoke this concert and this kind of activity. What about this activity that Milena was saying, art for social change, process-oriented, hardly to quantified, so only qualitative, maybe some analysis. So I think now it's a time that our sector, we practitioners and cultural institutions, maybe we should really think to define this exactly intrinsic value and to convince why it's important to invest in this, especially for this part of the value of arts and culture. So obviously this creative industry concept is in question now. Creative class, we know Richard Florida now it's regretting, it's sorry about this. So it's really now it's going debate how far, where we are going with the creative industries. So now it's a turning point, I think, again, coming back to the definitions, I think it's time to really open this discussion and really see where to go and how to use the public money, actually, for the things that we are doing, which is connected what you also said, why and what we are doing. And to, of course, to use the public money again. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. I think that what Arundhati was saying as well is kind of what my reflection was as I was listening to some of the discussion both on the panel and on the floor as well, that these debates and the arguments that we use will vary from context to context. We wouldn't be having this discussion in Germany, for example, where there's a lot of money for the arts and there's a real commitment on the part of the government to the arts in terms of public funding and the like. But we would be having this and other discussions in Cameroon or in Somalia, So I'm just wondering about obviously there's a certain kind of generic usefulness to having some of these issues arising where we can talk about them. But it's almost as if we need to come up with why do we need to be making these arguments in particular contexts? Is it because the government is ideologically opposed to the arts? Where for them the arts are, just as in the Netherlands a few years ago, there was this argument made that it's just like a lefty hobby. And so public funding must not go towards the arts. So it's an ideological kind of thing. Is it a thing to do with finances in the context of a country that isn't exactly poor and isn't exactly wealthy, and they have a whole bunch of other kind of pressing needs, and so the arguments to be made in that context. I mean, that's something that we faced in South Africa post-1994. We were told, but the arts are a luxury when you look at the legacies of apartheid. We've got to deal with housing and education and job creation, and you come to us with the arts? I mean, really? And of course, we need to then find the arguments that convince decision makers that their argument in that regard doesn't really hold water necessarily. So maybe there's a need for us to almost define what are the different contexts on which arguments need to be made, and then find ways of finding the best arguments, to respond to those conditions. But thank you very much, for your participation from the floor. I'm just going to end by asking the panel to respond to any of the things that you might have heard. Justin, shall we start with you and just go around this way?
Yeah. Just say two things. One about commercialization or marketization, the pressure on arts organizations. It is about cutting money. You've got to make your money out of ticket sales and all that kind of thing, all that. And it stops risk. But the deeper logic is something else. And the deeper logic is that what commercialization does in the arts is it reduces the audience to an aggregation of consumers. And the reason why that is successful and that's not successful is because all of those people have chosen it. They've chosen to spend their money there rather than there. And that is the only information you need to have. If you're doing the arts, where it's a bit more difficult because there's a bit of subsidy and it's not quite clear what the outcomes are, then you get something like Culture Counts, which is basically a quasi-market app to that kind of thing. But the same thing, it's the aggregation of individuals making a choice. And it's the deepest ideological edifice on which the whole onslaught onto the arts is taken by. And that's why radical co-creation is so radical, because what it tries to do is take people out of that aggregated kind of consumer mentality and say, you or we will work towards deciding. You make a decision. It's not like, that's nice, do we like that? You decide. You have to decide. And it's a difficult process sometimes. So it's that creation of a different kind of person that's so important, really. And the second thing, which is related to that, which is the popular. Don't let popular get colonized by populism. Because once we get those kind of things happening, and once we get those, how are you going to speak to large groups of people? What kind of language is there? What kind of images? And I've been reading a lot about the Cultural Revolution in China. And it's quite amazing, actually, that the model operas, which are seen as the worst kind of ideological, instrumental propaganda rubbish, actually began to be a kind of very, very innovative cultural practice. The way they put together Western music, Chinese dance around a message. And, it's back to that thing. We have to decide, and we have to decide on what works artistically, what works to do that. And I think we have to do that now in a popular context, because the arts have locked themselves in a little room for too long, really. And if we're going to get any of these agendas going, we've got to rethink the popular in a cultural context.
So maybe about the issue about the argument for the culture and for the art. Somehow I really believe that the argument, and this is some kind of cognitive naivism, that people from culture and art and people from academia tend to produce in the public discourse. Like the argument is like we live in a Habermas type of world where we have discursive practices, and we in public sphere we discuss, and then the best arguments are prevailing. So I really think that it's all about positioning, recognizing the dynamics of power, intervene and make tactical coalition, strategic partnerships with others, social groups. So I don't believe that argumentation is enough. So somehow we need action plan with the arguments, but this is not the arguments like, yeah, this is very important for humanity. So it is, definitely, but that doesn't mean that it will survive in this specific environment. So we have to all the time fight for, not only a general goals or long term, but what is happening right now. What kind of health insurance we have, what kind of infrastructure, public infrastructure we have for different things. So in that sense, how we organize ourselves around the arguments is for me the let's say the crucial thing, and the political involvement, different type of political, not only party, basically not party, but making going beyond the usual campaigning type of tactics for certain causes. So if we are not going into dynamic of organizing transversal, transsectorial type of alliances, that won't function. So if we don't deal with the climate change or with the union rights, they don't. So it's not about persuading them, look, culture is good for you, So it is in a real context, political context and social context, this is about recognizing each other. And sometimes you will have a hand from people who might be, with a lot of prejudice about your social group. Because culture is also issue about social groups. Some social groups are not involved. So to tell them that it is important for them, it's not fun. But when they recognize, so this is like a very, very, very subtle work with people. So you can't overcome this problem without making these, not networking in an American type of way, but building a real social capital around this coalition. So in that sense, most of the culture sectors are stuck in basically in these regions, and not in Germany, I suppose, are stuck in tactics of whining and, looking like everything is falling and waiting maybe that they will be on the road of dismantling them.
I think that's a very important point. It's not just about content, it's about organization and tactics and strategy, how we go about pursuing our interests.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I've written all over the paper, and now I've got to try and make sense of what I was going to say. A couple of things I just want to talk about quickly. The point about our institutions changing policy. I absolutely have seen this. I've seen institutions challenging, for example, the evidence or the evaluation of the impact of the arts really effectively, basically refusing to do it, and saying that what it's turned into is evidence as advocacy for funding, which produces a form of, let's produce pictures of people doing things. And I've seen that challenged. I've seen intercultural dialogue challenged when what it actually amounts to is heavy-handed social cohesion and the effects of that. So it is coming from institutions refusing and collectively refusing to do it. The other thing I wanted to mention, and hasn't been mentioned much in the conference, it seems to me, is how we have these conversations across differences, how we open up the dialogue, and what kind of methodologies you have to level a playing field where people can have those conversations in spaces that have all kinds of power differentials. I think that's a really big and open area. I'm going to be on a panel tomorrow, and I hope we're going to talk a little bit about that in more practical sense of what we can do. And then I guess the last thing I wanted to say was that whole issue again about it being context-based and it varying from country to country or location to location or neighborhood to neighborhood. But what a fantastic opportunity that is for the redefinition of culture in your context. And what a fantastic opportunity for public dialogue. That's where you begin the conversation. And I guess that's, again, this notion of radical collaboration and how you go about doing just that.
Yeah, I have no original point to make other than reiterating what was probably already said many times, that first, that institutions should mind public interest. Second, that they should be bold in articulating a progressive vision of the society, and third, that they should be able to step out of their comfort zone and maybe their immediate definition of mission in order to accomplish that.
Okay, so I just would like to add two things, and I totally agree what you actually said. So based on our experiences when we started the whole thing, we actually just saw that the institutions, I mean the basic institution doesn't provide any opportunity for discussions. So you don't have any other choice just to open up new segments. The fact is that I think that it's very, as you said, contextual based. So I can only speak about Hungary and what's actually happening right now, because probably it's totally different in other country. But that was one thing. So when we were mapping the whole system, that was one thing that we won't be able anytime to have a conversation with the local authority or at least open up a new discussion. So this was one thing. The other thing is that we knew that we're never going to get any money from them. So that's why we should have done some kind of an entrepreneurial way, and that's why we ended up in a social enterprise form, because right now we have a steady income from the market, and we are totally independent from any governmental money, and because of that we can do what our really what our values really driven us. So that's why. So this was the two main options how we are actually started the whole thing and why we are actually doing this. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm speaking about funding and about what Mirjana Dragicevic was saying also. I have an example from, and in favor of the argument for aspirational culture. I recently read an article about funding of culture in the super rich country Germany. And they said there was a problem because 25% of the population do not want to go to theater, ballet, museum, cinema, anything that they are funding through cultural funds. The question is, should anything be done and what is to be done. They will not be getting education, because their interests are taken care of by the market production of the kind of entertainment they want, and they stay somewhere by the wayside. Poor country, this one. Yesterday there was a Klapcher talk about funding, participatory funding and whatnot, and there was a representative of Klapcher, Miljenka, and she said that they had 55 organizations discussing in a participatory manner about how they are going to spend 25,000 euros and who is going to get the money. Now, I think we need to get rid of the austerity imagination, because austerity discourse is now already austerity imagination, especially here. And then I'll speak about super rich, supranational country, European Union. If you want to have a cultural project functional, you have to have 3 participants from 4 countries, 30% of this funding, 25% of this funding, 1 from Portugal, 1 from Nordic countries, 1 from the Balkans, 1 from... and then you get some peanuts. But if you want to have an aqua park, then you get the full refund, because it's investment and it's job creation and it's stupification of the nation, basically, by means of having more fun. See, I mean, we should think through these mechanisms of funding, and I think finally that there should be some discussion about transparency and trust. Usually people, when they tell you we need excellence, it means we don't have excellence. When they said trust is needed, it means we don't have trust. And especially in the field of culture, poor people, there is no trust. I work with ministries of culture and science in the poor country of Croatia. When you want funding for the book and you apply to the Ministry of Science, you get the funding. If you are not finished in the year in which you applied for funding, they say nothing. Okay, we'll see. So they maybe ask you next year or never. They ask you, so then they lose the money. Tough break. They lose 10,000 euros. But if you're in the sector of culture, if you are not finished by the end of the year, give us 30% back. And if you're not finished in January, 30% more. And then, we'll discuss this. And next year, and for the 3 years, you will not have funding and so on. We need to get of the austerity imagination, which has been instilled on us very, very firmly, very deeply running right now, and it's time to end this thing. I think.
Okay, actually I will just briefly talk about 2 issues, and one is about the terms, and then it's about the argument. Concerning the terms, I think we are dealing with jargonization of different terms we are using every day. So probably we should start the jargonizing most of our terms, especially, for example, all these appropriated terms or kind of like from European Union that we're using every day, cultural diversity, but also we can see nowadays, probably in the next future, appropriation of participative governance somewhere else. And I believe that maybe digging up into the organization of these terms that are important for us working as a practitioners in culture, we can try to redefine the arguments about what is important for us and why we do arts and culture, or actually, as you said, to talk with the decision makers and give them the arguments back. However, for me, it's important to see again culture as a resource, not to find only resources, so look the resource in economy, but in culture. And I believe that, yes, the culture can be seen as, deliver services that cannot be delivered, as you said, or probably not to be seen through the impact, which is transfer of some political agenda. So in that sense, these arguments probably and should be very located into the local context, because we have diverse specificities in the environments where we work. So I would end that when I talked now with our Minister of Culture, Roberta Ladiozovski, who is coming from this sector of independent culture, when he was not a minister, we talked on a debate, and he said, Actually, I was the one from the independent sector. He should have been this devil's advocate or a person in a political position. He would say, why I would really give money to this space for contemporary arts and culture that you're talking about. I would rather give, money for different activities, social activities through arts and culture and etc. And I said, because you can see what happened after 11 years not giving money for contemporary arts and culture in Macedonia. It's overproduction of the national symbolics and very much this nationalistic agenda which produced and enhanced in the whole society of Macedonia xenophobia, of course, and different type of not wanted effects. So therefore, I think we can continue the discussions and arguments about why we need the contemporary arts and culture or arts and culture in our environments.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that participatory summary from the panel. And thank you very much for attending and for your participation as well. Maybe just on your behalf, thank you very much.